Hello and welcome to the ALCSI podcast, where we share the stories of lung cancer patients and their caregivers, as well as the work of doctors and researchers in the field. Today, we have the great honor and privilege of having Taylor Duck with us. Taylor Duck is a two-time graduate of East Carolina University with a bachelor's degree in political science and a minor in business administration, as well as a master's in public administration with a focus on health policy. During her college tenure, she played soccer for the Pirates, but was diagnosed with lung cancer at the age of 21, which ended her soccer career. Her unfortunate diagnosis ultimately shaped her career path and community involvement, as she has spent the majority of her time dedicated to raising awareness, advocating for better treatment options, and more research funding for cancer patients. She currently works for industry in the oncology space, and prior to her current role, she served as a physician outreach and market development manager for the Oncology Service Line at ECU Health in Greenville, North Carolina, the director of development for the College of Business at ECU, and as the community outreach manager for UNC Carolina Well Support and Survivorship program, which is part of the UNC Lineberger Comprehensive Cancer Support Program. And outside of her career, Taylor has devoted her time to serving the community through a number of local nonprofit organizations. She's married to Robert, who is a high school health and PE teacher and coach, and has a daughter, Dottie, who is 16 months old. They reside in Greenville, North Carolina, and spend as much time as possible at the beach during the summers with their chocolate lab, Cayman. Taylor, we're so honored to have you on our podcast today, so thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. So to introduce our moderators, my name is Priyanka Senthol.
My name is Medha Naga.
And my name is Anish Gugalam, and we are with the American Lung Cancer Screening Initiative, a national 501c3 nonprofit working to raise awareness of lung cancer and lung cancer screening. So to get started, Taylor, could you please share with us a little more about what your lung cancer journey has looked like so far?
Yeah, so I was diagnosed in October of 2007. So I am coming up on my 16th cancerversary is what I call it. So it's the everybody celebrates that date a little bit differently in terms of their end of treatment or their start of treatment or whatever it is. But for me, it was the day that I was surgically resected. That's the date that I celebrate. But I was a college soccer player in the best shape of my life, had no really health issues, and worked really hard for a preseason and was ready to go. And then I got to campus in August and we were doing 2-a-days, and, I didn't feel quite right, but I was like, it's just really hot and we don't have air conditioning in our dorms, and, everybody was tired. And so I just kind of brushed it off. But what really started to make me realize that something wasn't quite right was that I couldn't pass a fitness test that you're required to pass in order to play. And it's called 120s, and basically you have to do 10 of them, and it's 120 yards, so a football field plus the end zones, and you have to make it down in 18 seconds and then back in 25, and then you have like a 30-second break, and then you go again. And on number 6, that number, the 18-second timeline goes down to 17 or 16 seconds. I don't remember exactly, but you're really pushing, and every single time I would fail when we got to that number. And so the only other symptom that I had was numbness and tingling in my toes. And I had nerve conduction studies done, CT, or not a CT, but a chest x-ray, a brain MRI, because just the numbness and tingling was the only weird thing. And everything pretty much just turned up normal, and except for the chest x-ray, which I didn't know at the time. We can circle back around on that because I didn't find that out until I was diagnosed. But the chest x-ray did say further follow-up was needed, but no one told me that. And I think that's because of the stigma that lung cancer has, and we can talk all about that. And I think y'all are very familiar with it, but I didn't fit the mold of what a lung cancer patient looks like. And so I think they just kind of dismissed it. And long story short, after an entire year of just pretty much being miserable and not performing at the level in which I was used to, I decided to stop playing soccer, and my life drastically changed because that was really all I had done my entire life, was dedicate to soccer, and I loved the game. And so I kind of had to find some new hobbies and some new friends, and I joined a sorority and got involved in student government and really enjoyed my college experience. But I kept getting recurrent pneumonia. And that is actually what caused me to get diagnosed. Was I had had multiple bouts of pneumonia where they had handed me a Z-Pack and kind of sent me on my way. And then one random fall afternoon, on fall break, I was home in my hometown of Wilmington, and I thought my appendix was rupturing. And it was Saturday night at 11 o'clock, and there was nowhere to go but the emergency room. And so my parents were actually out of town on a Boy Scout trip with my little brother in the middle of the woods. So my sister and I went to the emergency room, and we were able to identify that, after a CT of my abdomen and pelvis, that there was something wrong with my lungs. And that's ultimately what initially kicked off the diagnosis. And ever since then, it's been a learning curve to learn about the disease. And we can go into more details about what that workup looked like and things. But I know that y'all probably want to ask a few more things and talk about, y'all's initiative before we get going fully in my story.
No, thank you, Taylor, for sharing your cancer journey and timeline with us. I think we've heard for so many different patients that receiving their diagnosis was definitely not a straightforward path, because for a lot of these patients and for their doctors, lung cancer is not the first thing on their list, and so they've had to undergo multiple different tests, and oftentimes their lung cancer was detected incidentally. And so especially in your case, the time from symptom onset to actual diagnosis was several months and years. And so can you take us through what it was like to actually receive the diagnosis? Was it, I'm sure it came out of the blue, but was it, in a way relieving to have a diagnosis to explain the symptoms that you were feeling? But it would just be great to know kind of what was going through your mind then, and maybe like when you received your diagnosis, and then maybe, a couple of weeks, days later.
Yeah, so it was interesting because I was in the emergency room. So it was an ER physician that came in, and she said, your stomach looks fine, your appendix looks good, you do have a small cyst on your ovaries, but to be a 21-year-old, that's kind of normal. We're not really worried about that. She said, there is something a little concerning about your lung. There's a small spot. Do you know that your lung is partially collapsed? And I immediately was like, well, no, I didn't know that. And by the grace of God, a nurse came in after that physician and said, I just want to be very clear. And she crouched down beside the bed. It was almost like she was like a little bit breaking code and advocating for me, but she basically just said, I want to be very clear that this is not a small spot. It is a mass. It is 4 centimeters big, and your lung is almost completely collapsed. You immediately need to follow up. And that was kind of shocking. And then, I still, I wasn't clinical. I was 21 years old. I was there with my sister, who's 23. We were without my parents, couldn't get a hold of them because they had no service. But, I didn't ever really register like lung cancer at that point, because she just said mass. And so I didn't identify like this is lung cancer. It just made more. I was like, oh, well, no wonder I couldn't pass the fitness test. My lungs collapsed. I'm working on one lung, and on the right lung at that. So, I guess the time in which I was like, oh, this is really serious was after I left the emergency room. We followed up with pulmonary. Pulmonary did a bronchoscopy. Unfortunately, the bronchoscopy didn't reveal any diagnostic information. And so they basically referred me to a surgeon and said, this has to come out regardless if it's malignant or not. So, you need to have it out. And so we went to a surgeon in my hometown, and that's when it kind of was like, oh, this is way serious. He walked in and he said, so Miss Bell, which I was Taylor Bell before I got married, I understand that you have lung cancer. And we were all like, wait, what? Like, nobody had used the word cancer. Nobody had used the word malignant. My parents were both sitting there, and all of us just completely overwhelmed by that comment. And so he talked to us about the options for surgery, and, he wasn't fellowship trained thoracic surgeon. He was a general surgeon. And at the time, I don't believe that there were any thoracic surgeons in that area. And so, if I was going to receive care locally, that was going to be the option. And he talked about, an open thoracotomy and, rib spreading and all the stuff that comes with that type of surgery. And thankfully, my mom and dad, said, well, there's got to be a better option. And so we ended up getting a second opinion at Duke. And I was able to see basically the godfather of thoracic surgery. He pretty much pioneered VATS lobectomies and is widely respected across the world. And so that was a much better option for me in terms of, severity of the surgery and trying to minimize the pain and the recovery and all the things that come with a lung resection. And so thankfully I had parents who were willing to, push and get a second opinion, which ultimately I think really changed the trajectory of my life.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And it must have been so jarring to just suddenly hear that word lung cancer thrown around. And you mentioned that you were really fortunate to get a second opinion from a renowned thoracic surgeon, and that was how you got the VATS lobectomy. So could you talk a little bit more about what that means and what are the pros and cons associated with that procedure?
Yeah. So, I think that the main thing, this was 16 years ago. And so to see the advances that we've made just in the last 16 years is like so impressive, but it was definitely a better option then. And it's definitely a better option now. I personally, I don't think any patient should have to have an open thoracotomy unless that is truly their only option. I think that there's power in a second opinion. And I think it's important to know your options, and that comes with doing research and trying to be educated, which I think sometimes is really challenging for people because one, not everybody's clinical, but two, when you don't feel well, you might not necessarily have the energy or the option to spend time researching. And so I challenge physicians to be knowledgeable about surgeons in their communities and also in academia to know what their options are and what the differences are between, general surgery and a fellowship trained thoracic surgeon, and the importance of patients having the opportunity to get multiple opinions. And that's not to say that you can't receive really great care close to home in a community setting. 85% of patients in the world or in America are treated in the community oncology setting. So, but I do think that there is time and place for a higher level of care. And I think thoracic surgery is one of those things. And for me, I just felt an ease with being with Dr. D'Amico and the PA that literally is his right-hand man, Scott Balderson. They educated us. They drew pictures to explain. They talked through the entire procedure of VATS, which is video-assisted thoracoscopic surgery. That's a mouthful. VATS is a lot easier to say, but it's basically a small keyhole incision that is between the two ribs, and then about an inch and a half incision underneath my left breast. That is where the actual lung is pulled through. The small keyhole is where the camera goes, and it just allows for, no rib spreading. I'm not saying that it is not painful, because let me just tell you, nobody told me this until afterwards. But they say that thoracic surgery is the most painful thing that a patient can experience. And so, that recovery was not something I was expecting. I don't think I was really prepared for it. I think they thought that I would tolerate it really well because I was in really great shape and, highly motivated. I fit the diagram of, who is the ultimate patient that would benefit from a type of surgery. But I think for me mentally, I wasn't necessarily prepared for the level of pain because I was so young and I had never experienced any type of pain before. I'd never really broken a bone. I had never torn an ACL. I hadn't had a child. All of the things that they say, are really painful, I hadn't experienced. And so I just wasn't ready for the level of recovery as well. But I'm thankful that I did it, and I wouldn't turn back and choose a different option at this point. But I probably would have had more frank conversations of what my expectations were in terms of pain management, and as well as what the plan of recovery was going to look like, because, it really set me back a lot much more than what I had anticipated.
So Taylor, you mentioned at the tail end of the conversation, like recovery and pain management were some of the difficulties that you had to endure after the procedure. What are some strategies that you used to get through these particularly difficult times, like you mentioned, after both the diagnosis and the treatment and the procedure?
Yeah, so leading up to surgery, I was kind of in a state of denial, which I'm sort of grateful for. Otherwise, I think I would have gone crazy with the amount of anxiety that it could have brought on. But I was in such a mode of like, let's just get it out and be done with it, that I didn't really have a chance to think about it. I did have a bronchoscopy up at Duke so that they could try to get another biopsy. And unfortunately, I don't think it's anything related to Duke, but I got really bad pneumonia after that. And so I actually could not pass pulmonary function test because of the collapsed lung and the pneumonia in order for them to take me to surgery. So I had to wait several weeks to actually get the surgery done. And so during those few weeks, one, I was just really, really sick. So I didn't feel good. So I didn't really have time to like think about, the diagnosis itself. But two, it was before the law was in place where in order to be insured, you had to remain a full-time student under your parents' insurance. So we were trying to get everything figured out academically and what that looked like for me. Because obviously it altered my ability to be focused on my academics. And so a lot of that was just trying to get everything in order so that once I did go to surgery, I'd be okay. And so that's one thing that was good prior to the surgery. I just didn't have a chance to really be worried about it. I will say, the day or the night before surgery, I was definitely really scared. But I didn't have really any other option. And so, you just kind of roll with it and go with it and figure it out. I was really nervous about pain management, particularly because it was kind of at the forefront of the opioid epidemic. And I just, you have this thing in your mind about like, if I have to take narcotics, that I might possibly get addicted. And so I got really nervous about that. And we talked about it, and they said, well, if you're nervous about that, how about we try to do oral narcotics instead of IV narcotics, just to see if you can tolerate it. And so that was the plan going in. And I wish that there had been more discussion about pain management and that the difference between an oral and an IV drug, and because I think there's dependency issues for both of those. And I ended up having IV narcotics, and it made a huge difference in terms of my ability to manage the pain, but also my ability to get up and walk, which they want you up immediately following surgery. I mean, after you get out of the ICU, but on the step down unit. And that was a huge challenge for me. It was very, very hard. And so I had to be bribed. And so my parents, would say, that hair straightener that you really want, that you've asked for Christmas, like if you get up and walk a lap, we'll buy it for you. They had done anything and everything that they could to get me out, because it just truly was so painful that nothing would work other than bribery. And at the time, I had recently just started dating my boyfriend, then now husband. I met him 2 weeks prior to my diagnosis, and he stuck with me through it all. And I think him being a high school coach made a big difference for me as well, because he had that motivation that, other people don't necessarily have. And so even though we were so new in our relationship and it was very, very raw to bring somebody into the fold, he wanted to be there. And so I let him. And, ultimately I credit him a lot for my survivorship and my ability to push through, because he was with me, every step of the way. And then, once I got done and through recovery, I had my surgery on November the 15th. And then I had to be back at school that following January to start, because if I wanted to keep my health insurance, I had to be a full-time student. And so I think that if that wasn't the case, I probably would have taken another semester off and really focused on my recovery, but I needed health insurance. And so I had to go back to school. And so we worked on, trying to build up my stamina so that I could walk to class, and just trying to work through any of the challenges that brought, because, at that point it was hard to carry a book bag. It was hard to dress myself. It was hard to get up out of bed by myself. All of those things were a challenge. And so just working through the logistics of that.
Wow, I think your story brings a very unique perspective, since you were a student when you were diagnosed, and it's I think a lot of us here are right around the 2019 years age range, and it's just, I couldn't even begin to imagine what a diagnosis like lung cancer would even, entail in terms of impacting my life. And I think as a student, you're very focused on academics and, the next step, and just to have to understand and think through, what a surgery would bring in, and what life after surgery would look like. I think it's not something that a lot of students go through, and so I wanted to ask about that. So switching gears a little bit was, after receiving your diagnosis, did that change your outlook, your perspective, your priorities? You mentioned that you had to go back to school in order to keep your insurance. So you're back in school very quickly, but did that change anything in terms of, your future goals, and how did you deal with the uncertainty of what a lung cancer diagnosis would bring? Because 16 years ago, the prognosis for lung cancer, it's definitely gotten better over the years, but even now a lot of patients tell us, like, when I received my diagnosis, there wasn't a lot of hope for lung cancer patients. And so I can only imagine that 16 years ago it was even worse than what patients are feeling right now. And so could you talk to us about how you navigated those emotions and that uncertainty?
Yeah, so it was definitely doom and gloom. I kept looking for people online, stories that were similar to mine. And it was right around the time when like blogging had just kind of come out and Facebook was just kind of getting started. I think it had just come to the point where you didn't have to actually be invited to be on Facebook. Anybody could be there. But initially it was everybody, you had to be invited and you had to be at a certain university and all of those things. So everything, hashtags didn't really exist. So there was really no way to find stories of hope. And so every time I'd go to a blog, it'd be like, oh, and so died. And you're like, okay, this is not a good place to be. So I immediately stopped that and I stopped Dr. Google. I did not Google anything. I have a family history of lung cancer as well. So my grandmother, my great grandfather, and my great uncle have all died of lung cancer. And so my grandmother's diagnosis, she was diagnosed and passed away 40 days later. So stage 4, and it was really, really sad. And that happened a little bit prior to my diagnosis. So it was really hard not to get in that mindset. But I just kind of, like I said, initially just rolled with the punches because I didn't have a choice. But I think where I really started to struggle was at my 3-month post-op visit. So all my girlfriends were on spring break in Jamaica, and I was having a hard time getting out of bed to dress myself. So clearly I was not in Jamaica with everybody else. And so I started to get really depressed. And I started to realize that my life was definitely different than it was before, and it would never likely be the same. And so I immediately got really depressed, and I was at my 3-month follow-up, and my surgeon had sat down on the stool in front of me, and he said to he's like, so how are you doing? Your scans are good. We're moving along. You don't have to have any type of systemic therapy, you're good. And I just started crying, and I said, this is really not fair. My life is very different. I'm in a lot of pain. Lung cancer has taken so much from me. And so he said, do you know anything about lung cancer? And I said, well, no, other than it's robbed me of my grandmother, my great grandfather, my great uncle, and now it's robbed me of my college adulthood life. And he's like, no. Do you know anything about the statistics of lung cancer? And so he just went on a path of, lung cancer is the #1 cancer killer of men and women in this country. It kills more people than breast, prostate, and colon cancers combined. It's the least funded of all major cancers. There's so many stigmas associated with the disease, which delay diagnosis and hinder care. And he just kept on and on and on and on. And he said, what has happened to you is not fair. No one should ever have to experience this, but you are a survivor, and you have the opportunity to make a difference. And are you willing to stand up for the 85% that don't have this chance? And at that point I was like, well, yeah, of course, I'm happy to do that. But what does that mean? How do I don't really know what how I can make a difference. And he said, well, have you ever considered sharing your story? I'm like, doc, I'm literally 3 months out. Like I'm just trying to like get dressed in the morning. And he said, you know, I actually have an opportunity. It's next week. It's a presentation to 2,700 physicians and PAs. Are you interested in going? And I thought, oh my God, what have I signed myself up for? So that was my first speaking engagement. And ever since then, I mean, I pretty much haven't stopped. It's been important for me to share my story, but not only my story, but share about the facts of lung cancer and to try to change the face of the disease and to break the stigma that's associated with it, and to push physicians both in the primary care setting, but also, you know, in oncology and thoracic surgery and pulmonary and anybody that has the potential to touch a patient's life to, you know, really treat lung cancer as an emergency where patients deserve compassion regardless if they smoked or they didn't smoke, and everybody deserves the exact same care in terms of the chance to fight. And so, you know, I've been on this journey for 15 years, and, you know, initially I wouldn't say that I would choose it, but I would say that I'm definitely grateful for my diagnosis. It's changed. I didn't always feel that way. That mindset has changed over the years. And I think that the reason, as you grow in your survivorship, you start to see the beauty of the diagnosis as well. And it's changed my outlook on life. It's made me appreciate every day. It's given me a purpose, a platform. It's given me the ability to speak for people who don't have a voice. And it just keeps me fueled because it's a big monster that we're dealing with. And there is, like you said, we've come a long way in 15 years and a really long way in the last 5, but we still have a really long way to go.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. And before we move on to further questions about your involvement in the lung cancer community, I just wanted to touch on something that you mentioned earlier about patient advocacy. So you mentioned that when around the time when you were first diagnosed, your chest X-ray came back with further follow-up needed, but you weren't informed that further follow-up was recommended by the doctor. And you only found out about the findings on your chest X-ray when your mom requested all of your records. So what advice would you give to patients to ensure that there's a consistent line of communication with their doctor to ensure that they're fully aware of any findings or any recommended follow-up?
So I always encourage patients whenever a new patient reaches out to me or somebody asks if I'll speak to a new patient, there's several things that I recommend, but one of the main things is that I always ask for a copy of the report from the radiologist, but I also ask for them to pull up my scan and to show it to me and explain, you know, this is a chest CT and it's like a loaf of bread and it's pulled out in slices, and each slice sometimes can catch different areas of the lung. And, you know, I tell patients to do that as well with their physicians. That way you're aware of what's actually written on the report and that you've seen it with your own eyes. The other thing that I always recommend is, and it's not as important now because with medical records and having patient portals and all of those things, you can see a lot of the stuff that, again, 2007, that stuff was not available. So one of the things that was a challenge for me was that there was a lot of paperwork. And so it's a discharge summary or a bill or, you know, a scan result or, you know, clinical trial option or whatever it may be, patient education, literature. It got overwhelming. And so what I did was I had a tote bag and I literally stuck everything in that one bag. Even if I didn't have a chance to read it, I just stuck it in there. And then that way, if I needed it down the road, I knew exactly where it was, as opposed to like in a random mail bin and on my desk and in my book bag and in my pocketbook. It was just one centralized place. And so I always encourage patients to do that. The other thing that I encourage folks to do is to really try to educate themselves. And there's now numerous resources and foundations that provide that type of information to them. And so I encourage them to, you know, print out the new lung cancer. You've been newly diagnosed with lung cancer. These are questions you should ask your physician, or things that you should do, or things you should ask about. And it's just a matter of like being an advocate for yourself or for others who have been diagnosed that you're helping. And I like to call it respectfully question authority. And so challenge your physicians, ask questions. If you don't understand, tell them to wait a minute and to sit down and to have a conversation. And, that's gotten a little easier for me, but sometimes it can be a challenge because doctors are really busy and they do this every single day. And it's like talking, regular, like you and I are talking, but they're using all these complex medical terms and you don't really know. And there's all these acronyms and genetic biomarkers and all these things. And as a patient who doesn't feel good, it can be really, really overwhelming. So making sure that you have somebody that can help and advocate for you or take notes, or I actually turn my phone on and ask the physician, would it be okay if I take a voice memo of you talking to me so that I don't miss anything? I've never had a physician tell me no. So, it's just a way for me, if I am there by myself, to have an extra set of ears so that if I do have a question, I can go back and, listen to it again. So that'd be a word of advice as well. Did I answer all your questions? I'm like, ugh.
I think that was great, Taylor. So Taylor, we really admire your efforts in the lung cancer community. Could you describe some of the things that you're currently doing advocacy-wise within the community?
Yeah, so I've been really fortunate to have the opportunity to work with several foundations and organizations, and I think that all of them do really, really important work. And so for me, I've never really chosen one specific foundation to work with because I think they all have a purpose. And so, Bonnie Adario with the Adario Lung Cancer Foundation, that is now the go-to foundation for lung cancer, was started by Bonnie, who is a lung cancer survivor, and her entire family have dedicated their lives to trying to make a difference for patients. And they're based on the West Coast, and they recently merged with the Lung Cancer Alliance, which was based out of DC, which is policy focused. And so they it's actually like the perfect marriage because lung cancer and the funding and the policy related to it, as well as the patient support, education, awareness, research, is really important as well. And so those two organizations merging together, I think, was a really great thing. And they have wonderful patient resources and really well connected in terms of the lung cancer community. And so I've done a fair amount of work with them, particularly after Jill Costello was diagnosed with lung cancer, stage 4. She was a rower, a coxswain at Berkeley, and actually rowed for the national championship right during her diagnosis, or towards the end of her life, before she passed away, unfortunately. But we started organization under Bonnie called Jill's Legacy, which was trying to change the face of lung cancer, particularly for young adults, and bringing awareness to the disease. That organization has since kind of rolled up underneath Go-To Foundation, and they have that encompassed in their work with their young lung cancer study and all of the work that they're doing. But that's what kind of fueled Bonnie to start the young lung cancer study. So I have a lot of respect for them. And then locally, I'm from North Carolina, and the Lung Cancer Initiative in North Carolina, I think, does really great work. It funds young investigative researchers, particularly because, early on, around in 2007, after my diagnosis, one of the things that I learned that was shocking was that a lot of researchers didn't choose to go into lung cancer research because they were worried that they would not be able to receive the funding that they needed in order to sustain their research. And that just blew me away, that there was people that were truly interested in trying to study lung cancer and understand more about it, and were choosing different career paths because they weren't going to be funded. That to me is unacceptable. And so the Lung Cancer Initiative of North Carolina funds young investigative researchers in North Carolina specifically. And so for me, that's been work that I do with them as well. And then I make these holiday bows that you can put like on a door wreath. And so through those bow sales, as well as my Like to Know It, which is an app that you can shop things that I link, and I make a small commission. I donate 100% of all of my proceeds from that, as well as my bows that I sell, to lung cancer research, awareness, and education. And I pick different foundations throughout the year that are specifically supporting that cause, and choose to give it. So that's a few things that I do, and a fair amount of public speaking, but that has slowed down a little bit just because of starting my family and not being able to travel as much as I'd like.
Well, it's so inspiring to hear your work, Taylor, and I think we've actually covered a very small portion of all of the work that you've done in this field, and so we would love to ask a couple of questions targeted some of the different organizations you've worked with and efforts you've led, if that's okay. And so you shared with us earlier that you launched a survivorship program within your hometown under the UNC Comprehensive Cancer Support Program. And so could you please share more about this survivorship program as well as the survivorship care plan?
Yeah, so survivorship was kind of a new term after I was diagnosed, and a lot of people didn't really know what that means. And I still think that we're learning what that means as we continue to have more and more survivors. But I was hired right out of college to work for UNC Chapel Hill, but I was placed here in Greenville, which was the perfect fit. And they have the Comprehensive Cancer Support Network, which is run by Don Rosenstein at UNC. And this term support and survivorship was so new that a lot of people didn't really know what to do or how to do it. But how do you help patients live a meaningful life past their diagnosis, and manage through possible late and long-term effects, and to help improve continuity of care and all of the things that come with being a long-term survivor. And so I had the privilege to stand up a support and survivorship program here in Greenville. And so we created support groups for patients, both disease specific as well as not disease specific. We used exercise and movement. We had an art therapy program, so patients could do art when they were, receiving chemotherapy, pet therapy. We also had a 6-week psychosocial program that helps patients transition from, active medical oncology, radiation, surgical oncology care back into the primary care setting. And it focused on emotional health and well-being and exercise and nutrition. And it just was meant to be the bridge to help those patients say, you know what, you're good. You can transition back into the primary care setting to receive, your regular care that you would get from a primary care physician. So that was really cool. And then there started to be some conversation about what is a survivorship care plan or a treatment summary, and what does that look like? And so, there are metrics now that are in place with the Commission on Cancer and institutions that are, quite frankly, required to do this for these patients. And so we worked on pulling information out of the electronic medical record that would be important for patients to have, so that they had, a 3 to 5 page concise document of their cancer diagnosis, the treatment that they received, the dosing, the grades of radiation, where they were radiated, any surgery that they had had, which ultimately just helped them transition back into the primary care setting. Because I think for a long time, myself included, anytime there was anything wrong with me, I'd be like, okay, well, I'm going to call my surgeon. And, it was completely unrelated to anything that had happened with me related to my thoracic surgery. But I felt comfortable with him because he had been taking care of me. And so I could imagine how challenging it is for patients that do have to have chemotherapy and radiation in addition to surgery, because you get nervous that your primary care physician might not understand, or, is it a later long-term effect related to my systemic therapy, or was it just really a UTI? Like, what are the issues? So it helped it was meant to help patients kind of bridge back into the primary care setting and feel comfortable and confident that their physicians could take care of them. So that was part of the work that I did.
Thank you for sharing that. And could you also share a little bit more about the lung cancer screening program that you recently helped launch? When you spoke with our team, you shared that 1 of every 26 scans was a positive scan, and that 85% of patients were diagnosed at stage 1. And could you also share more about what you think is helping to drive this stage shift to diagnosing more lung cancers at early stages, and what other lung cancer screening programs may be able to achieve similar results?
Yeah, so prior to coming to industry, I worked for a large academic healthcare center in Eastern North Carolina that had a level 1 tertiary center and then 8 community hospitals across 29 counties in Eastern North Carolina. And, we are in a place where there is unfortunately a high incidence of smokers. And so we had a lot of at-risk patients, and we had a very dedicated thoracic oncology team that was committed to making a difference for lung cancer patients. They cared about, early diagnosis, time to treatment, doing all the molecular and genetic testing that needed to be done and giving the right treatment for patients. And so part of that mission and the buy-in from that team was also like, how can we make a difference for newly diagnosed or people that are at risk that have no idea that they're even at risk, or that they, are ashamed of the stigma that's associated with the lung cancer and smoking. And so how can we make a difference for them? And so we had a pulmonologist, Mark Bowling, who pretty much just said, we're moving forward and we're doing this and we will figure it out. And so part of my job in that role at ECU was to stand up and ultimately get patients screened. And so I would call on referring physicians throughout the communities and talk to them about lung cancer screening and what it is and who qualifies, and how they can get their patients in the door and what the back end follow-up looks like. Because I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we currently face, is that it's not necessarily that physicians don't want to do it, it's that they're overwhelmed and have a challenge of how do you manage the back end process of, if a patient has a lung RADS 3 or 4 and needs to be screened, how do you keep up with that, and who manages it, and who sends the letter, and all of the logistical and operational things that can hinder people actually being screened. And so I worked with the physician team, but also the administrative and referral and access team to really try to streamline that process and make it as easy as possible. And ultimately what we came up with was, a 1-page referral form. And on the front of the form, it included, what is lung cancer screening? Why would you benefit? Who qualifies? A graph to basically show and calculate how many pack years of smoking you have. And it was really meant for the physician to talk through it with the patient about, you would benefit and this is why. And then on the back side was the actual referral form. And it was into one portal of entry into our healthcare system, where a team of schedulers would schedule the screening, call the patient, send a map and directions to the patient about where and when their appointment is and how to get there. And then it also had a box with the shared decision-making language that needed to be included in the order set in order to be approved and paid for by insurance. And so it checked the box for the referring physician, because he could just scan it into the patient's chart, and then he had, it had documentation that I've discussed with the patient. We've talked about smoking cessation and all the things that are required. And then it also took the work off of their team to make the referrals, because all they had to do is send it to this one portal, and we had a team that did everything for them. And then on the back end, we had a lung cancer screening coordinator that did all of the back end follow-up. So if a patient had normal results, she would either inform the physician that referred or inform the patient, whatever the physician preferred, because some physicians just say, y'all handle it and deal with it. And some physicians are like, no, I'd like to tell my patients. So we gave physicians the option to do whichever they would prefer. But it basically just took all of the legwork and the pushback that you would hear from referring physicians about it, and made it so that they couldn't say no, because they had no choice, because it was so easy that it was like, okay, if you don't do it here, then you're really doing a disservice to your patients. And it's not because you're too busy or don't know how to refer them. It's because you don't believe in screening your patients. And so we were excited. We saw, we scanned a lot of people, and it's been 4 years since I've been there. So I don't want to quote any specific numbers, that they're currently seeing, but I think that we obviously initially were targeting, the cream of the crop in terms of high risk patients. And so I think that is why we saw such a high incidence, because, we were seeing the most at-risk patients. I think that number has kind of slowed down in terms of positives, but it's definitely still way more than 1 in 320, which the National Lung Cancer Screening Trial, revealed. And so that team continues to be committed to really trying to change the game for lung cancer. And I just applaud them, because it's not easy. And in my current job, you hear about people and you read about, people struggling to try to figure out how to make this work and where are the barriers and how as institutions can we make a difference to screen patients, because if breast cancer is doing it in the high 70s and prostate cancer is the same way, there's no reason that lung cancer should be 5-6% nationally. I mean, it's just uncalled for, particularly when if you can catch lung cancer early and surgically resect them. And now with neoadjuvant and adjuvant therapy, I mean, you can, I hesitate to use the word cure because I don't even use that for myself, but you can make cancer a chronically manageable disease as opposed to a death sentence.
That's awesome, Taylor. So we're kind of getting near to the end of the podcast, but just wanted to ask you, where can people find you on social media? How can they connect with you? You have a ton of initiatives going on that are super interesting and fascinating, and we'd just love to get that out to our audience.
Yeah, so I'd love for people to connect. You'll see it if you follow me on Instagram. You'll definitely see a lot of my little girl and my husband and my dog, but I also post a fair amount about lung cancer stuff. So I want to make sure I tell you right. So taylor.bell.duck on Instagram. And I think the same as on Facebook, LinkedIn. I'm pretty much out there everywhere. So I'd love to connect and hear from people. One of the biggest blessings of all of this is that I get the opportunity to connect with other people who have been touched by this disease. And, I hope that my content provides a sense of hope and that, this you can survive. And I just try to be as positive as possible, but also share the truths of lung cancer and, that we still have so much work to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Taylor, truly has been a pleasure and honor to talk with you and learn from the wealth of knowledge and experience you have in the area of cancer advocacy. All of us truly appreciate all the work you're doing. So thank you so much. And thank you to our listeners for joining us on this episode of the ALCSI podcast. We hope you enjoyed it, and please keep an eye out for our upcoming podcasts and events, which will be listed on our website, www.alcsi.org. Thanks again, Taylor, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you so much.